welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a guide for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters, and the questers of Josh and Dan. I am Dan.
I am Josh.
Yes, and by now, if you don't know that, because we're 82 episodes in, if you can't tell one voice from another, I'm sorry for you.
Hey,
but on today's...
somebody might just be joining us. We are not, this is not like a narrative where somebody needs to start back at episode 1.
Why not? I'm teasing. I know that. But on today's episode, we'll be discussing all things Arrowentical again, because we're going to talk about one of the great dragons, Mountainshadow.
Oh, yeah.
So, I prepped like a month ago, and Josh has a super great trap for a mind who remembers more than what I can prep in the first place. So we're going to see how this one goes. So if there's any questions you have at the end of this episode about Mountainshadow, then please email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. And until those questions come in, let's just kind of wade in deep a little bit with Mountainshadow, described by Outcast as a meddler of things, but his real dragon name is Far Scholar. So let's just start there.
Yeah.
Impressions on Mountainshadow.
Mountainshadow is, again, dragons are dragons. We've talked about dragons, how they're not necessarily nice, how they have a very long-term, they tend not to be, like they can be fond of individual name givers, but they don't tend to be overly romantic. That's not the right word.
Fair.
Nostalgic.
Yeah, that's a good
perhaps
word.
Is a better word.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to make a list of dragons that are ostensibly good guys,
mm-hmm.
Mountainshadow would probably be one of the first ones on the list on that side of the chart.
Yeah, good, evil. Dragons are all independently motivated characters, but can fall on one side of that of that cheat sheet or not. More benevolent than harmful.
A lot of Mountainshadow's character is kind of informed by his presence in Shadowrun as Dunkelzahn. You can kind of see in some ways where Dunkelzahn developed from Mountainshadow. Dunkelzahn, loves humanity. Dunkelzahn is really, on people's sides in the Shadowrun universe. He's really on people's side.
Mm-hmm.
And while, again, he might have fondness for individuals, but he is a lot more interested in shepherding humanity forward. Not quite so much in the Earthdawn era. There's a certain amount of maturity that grows in his standing in that regard. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, Mountainshadow is a meddler. He is a lot less active or a lot less visible in the sense of him being involved, but him and his brother Icewing are really two of the major drivers of the greater Barsaive community of dragons against the Therans.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, the Outcast and the Denerastus as well.
So he does meddle, but his real dragon name is not Mountainshadow. That's what the name givers call him. He is actually Far Scholar because he collects as much lore and legends and goings-on as possible. He wants to know everything. And we mean everything. All the movings and doings and shakings and history and history of the lands, history of the people who shaped the land, history of the legends who took care of things, history of all the items that were involved in all that stuff. We mean flippin' everything. Mountainshadow wants to know it all. But he and his brother were both raised by All Wings, so they're one of the original clutch of dragons from eons past.
Yes.
The other thing I like to point out is all the pictures in any of the books are mostly in black and white, but I want to know what each dragon kind of looks like. Since, they're magical, they can kind of change their form, but as a default, Mountainshadow has usually silvery blue scales. Other dragons don't, and some of them have other colors, but I always like to know in my head, when I'm talking about Mountainshadow, he's silvery blue. Just one of those things. His domain is in the Dragon Mountains, because you do. But he also does happen to lair in the Badlands. So
yes,
if you're going to...
He does have another lair in the Badlands. If you have read the novel Poisoned Memories, the third of the Gerol trilogy, which involves the Death Rebellion and the attempts by the Theran magician Mordum to take control of Prince Neden to potentially have him be a puppet, a Theran puppet on the throne. Mountainshadow takes the prince to a lair he apparently has in the Badlands to remove the Theran enchantments and so forth that were placed on him.
Yeah. When is the last time you read that novel? Because I haven't read that in 25 years, and I remember nothing about
a while.
See, Josh's memory is better than my prep.
Well, I've got the PDF of the Dragon's source book up on my screen here and was kind of flipping through it and going, oh yeah, because the Outcast in his report says, I have yet to discover Mountainshadow's other lair in the Badlands, the place from which he aided young Prince Neden during the Death Rebellion.
But still,
like, oh yeah, that was the third book. But you were able to
tie that into the third novel, which I haven't read in forever and a day. So again,
right.
Josh's.
I know, like, it's pretty easy to remember, really.
Yeah.
The Longing Ring is the rediscovery of Parlength.
Mm-hmm.
Mother Speaks is the first Theran War.
Yeah.
And
Poisoned Memories
is the Death Rebellion. Like, those are the three big historical events that those novels are set around.
Yeah. It's just been 25 years and I can't remember any of that.
Details of the story, beyond knowing that Gerol is involved and as a result the magician Mordum is involved.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it, and there's this whole thing with death and blah, blah, blah.
One of these days we'll do a book club, just the Earthdawn novels. Josh and I will read them, prep them, and talk about them on the podcast. When we run out of other things to talk about, we'll do that. Anyway, Mountainshadow currently is guarding a small clutch of eggs as well, and has,
at least as of the information in the Dragon's source book, which, while published by Living Room Games, and so the details are not necessarily wholly canonical, there is nothing as of yet that has been published intentionally to cancel it, and also 90% of the information in there is in setting anyway, so take with a grain of salt, unreliable narrator, etc., etc.
Yeah, because maybe perhaps Outcast has an axe to grind.
No.
That had to be said. Anyway, also in the Dragon Mountains, since that's where Mountainshadow primarily resides, aside from the Badlands as well, there are 3 other adult dragons also dwelling in the Dragon Mountains. They are Thunderwing, Fire Dancer, and Smoke Weaver. So, do you think possibly perhaps that they are students or essentially, air quotes, children raised by Mountainshadow?
Yeah. It's generally the case that dragons who reach adulthood initially lair in the same general area as the great dragon who fostered them, because throughout their youth and whatnot, that would have been where they were, because they would have been taught dragon customs and practices and traditions by the great dragon that fostered them, that clutched them.
Yes.
And so, presumably, even if they weren't necessarily one of Mountainshadow's clutches of eggs, and they probably were, but even if they weren't, the fact that they are lairing in his territory indicates that there is some kind of relationship there that would ostensibly make them allies, in a sense.
I agree. Because they're a little territorial, dragons are.
Yeah. Dragons are territorial, but there is also, a certain amount of respect and authority that great dragons have over other adults. And so if an adult would have a problem with a great dragon, they probably would not choose to lair near that dragon. That would
probably not
make a whole lot of sense.
No, it wouldn't bode well for them. Just going to say. Mountainshadow, as benign as he is, would still probably take issue with with that. We did bring up a number of podcasts ago, somebody had questions about the eyes of all wings, and that Mountainshadow has one of the eyes, Icewing has the other eye, and this is how they communicate.
With each other, yeah.
So is this mostly visual? Or is this more like a telephone call, in your estimation?
Considering that the eyes also allow the dragons that have them to scry on other places, I would suspect that it probably behaves kind of similarly to like a traditional like crystal ball.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So it'd be kind of like a video phone kind of situation. It's like a Skype call.
The earliest Skype call ever.
Without the shitty servers. So there probably is a visual component if they want it.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also just be like a conduit through which dragon speech could go.
Okay.
When you're dealing with like a super powerful artifact like that, it can kind of pretty much do whatever. But the fact it is called out that they can scry using them, that there probably is a visual component that's there if they want to use it.
I figure it's an eyeball, so I can't see why it wouldn't have a visual component. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't completely off base, because occasionally I am. So one of those things. So the thing about Mountainshadow, having collected all of the lore that he has and all the knowledge that he has, is that he pretty much knows more mystic secrets than just about anybody else. I don't think that's in dispute, really.
No.
And this is the even if the Outcast had an axe to grind, he's still deferential to say, yeah, he knows more than anybody else. Period.
Yeah. That can generally be said probably about any of the great dragons. If you're going to compare them to each other, Mountainshadow, when it comes to mystical secrets, magical lore, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's a reason that he became the dragon lore master after the death of Vazdanjas.
Yeah.
Because Vazdanjas was lore master, lore keeper before, but when he died, it passed on to Mountainshadow.
Yes.
And Mountainshadow kept it until his death in 20 whatever.
Yes.
2055 or 2056 or whatever the year of the election was.
Yeah.
So yeah, he has a lot of magical knowledge in kind of the similar way that I describe Alakia sometimes. He has probably forgotten more about magic than most people will ever learn in their lifetimes. He has got a lot of knowledge, a lot of secrets, and that can be one way that you could bring him into an adventure or a campaign in some way. If you've got some kind of mysterious or powerful magical effect or something like that, or a legendary item that you are searching for key knowledges on, petitioning Mountainshadow is certainly one way that you could possibly find out about it.
Yeah.
Mountainshadow is not necessarily an easy one to contact.
Approachable.
He doesn't have office hours the way that Icewing does. But, and this kind of ties into something that probably is on your list there, Mountainshadow has a very extensive network of agents and
Namegiver servants, yes.
Namegiver servants and folk that work for him directly or indirectly. He is not the only dragon to have done it, but is most notably one of the dragons who sheltered quite a number of Namegivers in his lair during the Scourge. And their descendants, recognizing in a sense that they owe their lives to the dragon, serve him very loyally. And one of the Outcast's suggestions to his children is that if you can turn his servants, that is incredibly good, but he is very good at sniffing out problem individuals like that.
Yeah, because again, great dragon. He's not going to be blindsided by...
Not going to be caught with his pants down, so to speak.
He's not going to be blindsided by somebody you may have slightly influenced with the promise of money or fame or fortune, or one legendary item, whoop-de-doo. Mountainshadow is not a dumb dragon. He is, by the way, as old as he is, a very potent spellcaster. I don't think there's a lot of spells he wouldn't know. And again, dragons can create their own spells from whole cloth when they need them. So if he needs something done, if there's not a spell in the book for it, he's just going to get it done because that's what dragons do.
Yep.
So speaking of his servants, he does have Rasper. Is it Rosper? Rosper. My handwriting sucked. Sorry, my notes. He's a drake servant, and this drake can change forms because it's not from the Bloodwood. And this Rosper is the one who stole the elves' ever-living flower.
At least according to the information in
the
Living Room Games.
Yeah. Because again, maybe Outcast has an axe to grind.
Right.
So why would you not accuse?
So this is where the Earthdawn timeline thing gets a little funky.
We got time. Go for it, Josh.
We got time. In Living Room Games, Barsaive at War.
Yes.
The way that the Blood Elves were coerced or whatnot into joining the fight against the Therans because they were going to sort of sit out was by the ever-living flower being stolen from the court and the Therans being framed for it. And so Wallachia sends a detachment out to smack him around.
Yeah.
And so within the context of the Living Room Games books, Dragons was released after Barsaive at War, and so is talking about some of the timeline advances that kind of happened in relation to that, and talks about saying, well, Mountainshadow was the one behind the theft of the flower, and Rosper was the Drake agent that was kind of involved in that. And that is certainly possible. We do know from Portfolio of a Dragon, which I mentioned a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
That reference that Mountainshadow makes to the ever-living flower, where he basically in his will returns it to Wallachia because he doesn't need it anymore. But whether within the framework of 4th edition, that's why the elves joined in the battle at the Triumph, that's the reason that they marched, is unclear, because that history is also kind of in character, in setting, and there are a lot of behind-the-scenes machinations and stuff that are not revealed because it's not public knowledge.
Yeah.
So whether that is actually what happened, whether Rosper was involved or not, are details that you, in your own game, if it becomes something that comes up, that you can sort of decide for yourselves within that framework, because all of the info about that is in character.
Yeah.
And so not necessarily 100% accurate or trustworthy.
Because again, all of this was laid down by Outcast, who may or may not have an axe to grind with the other dragons that are out there. So the last piece of information I have that might be helpful to a game master trying to work a dragon in a little bit, especially with Mountainshadow, is that Mountainshadow does have servants that are name givers, that are adepts, and they might be doing some of the hiring. He's pretty much got that nailed down to just one left, which is named Darktooth. But other than that, may not always be Darktooth. Darktooth. I don't know. It's a name.
Yeah. Mountainshadow, as I mentioned, has a lot of name givers that are descended from the folk that he took into his lair to shelter during the Scourge.
Yes.
And a lot of them still kind of live in the Dragon Mountains and serve him to various extents. But he does have those among them who go out into the rest of Barsaive and act as his eyes and ears.
Yes.
And pass information back, and maybe will hire adepts to take care of things without necessarily revealing the benefactor for whom they are working, at least at first.
Yeah.
That if the adepts over the course of the campaign prove themselves useful and loyal and valuable, might end up getting tasked with even more important tasks and eventually maybe find out who it is that they're working for.
Yeah.
The dragons have what's referred to as the Dragons Network. It's the spy organization and intelligence group that the dragons put together in the wake of the Triumph landing, or at least more formally, like sharing information among themselves because of what the Therans are up to and their desire to put them in their place. But that was the case even before the Triumph landed, to be honest. It's just that he stepped up his intelligence gathering game a little bit.
Yeah.
Darktooth is, yeah. I don't know how much we should reveal about Darktooth.
It's up to you.
Two things about Darktooth. One,
we got time.
In the Living Room Games version of Dragons, as well as the original draft of the Dragon Source book from first edition, at the end of the section on Darktooth, because all of these essays are annotated by Mountainshadow.
Yes.
Adding commentary and things like that. And we'll come back to a little bit of that here in a minute.
Yeah.
But his comment at the end of Darktooth section, where the Outcast is like, find out as much as you can, gather as much information as possible, and find some way that you may be able to turn him against his master. Mountainshadow's commentary to that is, I wish him luck. Darktooth is far cleverer and more capable than the Outcast imagines.
Yes.
This is, of course, highlighted by the fact that his Shadowrun name, his Shadowrun moniker, Dunkelzahn, is German for Darktooth. And it is strongly suspected that Darktooth
is Mountainshadow and
is in fact Mountainshadow just walking around in human form.
Yes.
As evidenced in at least one time in the Shadowrun novels.
Yeah.
But also in other Shadowrun source books, like he shows up at his inauguration in human form. So the idea that Darktooth is in fact just Mountainshadow, and that the Outcast has not been able to twig to that, is notable.
Yes. We'll provide for you now 3 seconds to recollect your brain after that explosion of mind-blowing proportions. So,
getting back to Mountainshadow's commentary.
Yes, please do.
When the Outcast is talking in this thing about the drakes and finding out secrets and trying to turn them, these are the areas where, like, reading between the lines, you can maybe get a little sense of what had happened in the distant past. Yeah. This is like one of those clues toward the elf relationship and whatnot. He says, our enemies may well try to turn our servants against us. I know others that say that a drake cannot betray its creator and master, but I must respectfully remind everyone that we believed the same thing of our servants once before and were proven tragically wrong.
Yes.
We should not make the same mistake twice.
And he's referring to the immortal elves, is he not?
He is referring to the immortal elves with that. It is almost
I got
certain.
one right.
Yes.
I got one right. Yay. Yay me. Any thoughts you have otherwise on Mountainshadow's personality, or any other ways to kind of slip Mountainshadow into a campaign, an adventure, a story, a plot point?
Sure.
Yeah. Throw them out.
Mountainshadow, as we mentioned earlier, really, really likes to know stuff. He is almost compulsively, almost has a compulsive need to study and understand things that he does not yet understand. He
would be the hoarder in this scenario.
Well, not even necessarily. I mean, a hoarder in the sense of keeping maybe lore and information and knowledge.
Yeah.
As a dragon, of course, he's got a hoard. He keeps stuff as well.
Yeah.
But that compulsion also can be a little bit of a weakness, because it could tend to mean that he will try and gather as much information about something as he can before taking action. He wants to be sure that he knows all of the details and wants to make as informed a choice as possible. In the grand scheme of plotting things, when you're talking about the movement of nations and that sort of thing, that's not a huge problem. But it could, if you are somehow interfering with his plans or schemes in some way. If you are acting quickly and spontaneously, in a sense, you might be able to get away with that for a little bit, because he might not be as quick to act against you if you are able to keep him off balance. Now, you won't be able to keep him off balance forever.
No.
If you are being annoying enough that he is turning his attention to you, It is only a matter of time before he figures things out.
Because he can play the long game where you can't.
Yeah. So that is one thing that is a kind of a key aspect of his personality. And it is also potentially a way that you could, as player characters, get into Mountainshadow's good graces.
Either A, by providing him information. Is that an idea?
Yeah.
That maybe he doesn't have?
If you can bring to his attention, potentially get his support, if you can bring to his attention some kind of mystery or old lore or magical thing or whatever, and it is not something that very clearly would require him to tread in the domain of another dragon, because he will be careful about that. That is a way that you could potentially gather his support. If you have some kind of expedition that is seeking secrets or knowledge, like if you've got some kind of really epic quest or campaign arc going on where, say, the group is trying to find out what's going on with the Badlands, especially where he's got rumored to have a secondary lair in the Badlands. Maybe you could find some way of connecting up with his servants or networks or whatever, and perhaps get his support in investigating something, if you can actually bring something to his attention that would be of interest to him.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're probably not going to get his support to investigate stuff relating to Erin's Morgath, which we will talk about with a later dragon, because obviously that is in the domain of another great dragon. He's not going to go treading on those claws.
No.
But anything...
Yeah, he's not
anything kind of along those lines.
He's not going to want to know
there's
anything
that.
about like Joe and Betsy down at the bar. He's going to want, legendary movers and shakers type knowledge.
He is, as part of his desire to understand and to know, he is really interested in understanding name givers, in understanding people and what makes them tick, and exploring their minds and experiences and cultures and all that sort of thing. It is in part that experience that spurs his growth and the changes in personality that we see in Shadowrun. But that's something that's also really interesting and fascinating for him. And that's just kind of an extension of his desire to understand and know as much as possible. Obviously, if we're looking at the information provided in the Dragon Source books, there's stuff that is not quite as relevant anymore.
Mm-hmm.
One of his primary goals listed in the Dragon Source book is to deal with the Theran Empire. The Therans, while not permanently dealt with, have largely been driven out of Barsaive. Certainly, if they were to start acting up again, Mountainshadow would be interested and potentially involved. So that's another way that you might be able to get his involvement in a campaign. Possibly if you are running like a Theran game where your characters are working for the Theran Empire and perhaps operating some kind of plan to reassert some kind of dominance, Mountainshadow would be an adversary or antagonist trying to interfere with those plans.
Yeah.
Likewise, if you're running a game where you are dealing with a Theran plot to try and come back and your player characters are working against it, they might be able to get some assistance from Mountainshadow if things are sufficiently dire. Obviously, his interest in his domain, the Dragon Mountains and the things that go on there, he'll obviously always have kind of interest going on with that. It's possible that you could have a game that, even if there isn't a major campaign arc, you might have a story or an adventure or something that involves the Dragon Mountains in some way. Maybe there's a Forgotten Care, maybe there's something else going on, and at that point you're dealing with his territory. And maybe you won't necessarily deal with Mountainshadow directly, but you might need to deal with his agents or the other adult or, younger dragons that are part of his sort of extended family in a sense in that area.
Or any of the name giver servants he's got running around as well.
Yeah, or any of the name giver servants and so forth that you might have going on there.
Yeah.
The Dragon Source book does talk about how Mountainshadow did have more drakes, but a couple of them have disappeared, and Mountainshadow theorizes that the Denerastus are connected to that somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in 4th edition, we are several years beyond that point, but that could potentially be a thread. The drakes and the magical knowledge that drakes represent, in a sense, in terms of their creation, is certainly something that could be explored. And whether you're dealing with the Dinarastis or with some other magical organization that is looking to uncover those secrets, perhaps to create servants of their own, that could be something that could come into play. The Drake servants are kind of the second tier. If a dragon is acting publicly as a dragon, stuff's gotten real.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, if it is a serious matter, dragons do not have a lot of Drake servants. If they are sending their Drake servants, things have also gotten real, but there is a certain amount of plausible deniability there because the Drakes tend to have more established covers and lives as name givers than the dragons would.
Yeah.
But again, that's the sort of thing that generally you wouldn't be bringing into play until you're getting into upper journeyman or higher tier areas. The attribute values and numbers for drakes and dragons are very scary and not anything to trifle with.
Exactly. So do you think the Dinarastis would actually leave a drake corpse around, like in a dungeon somewhere, and if you tossed into it, you might find it and therefore be able to trade that information? Or do you think they would actually cremate that dragon and cover up all traces? The Drake. Sorry, the Drake. Servant. Because Mountainshadow missing a few servants. Perhaps they were behind one, and it's just a speculation.
I think that if the Dinarastis were to get their hands on a Drake, we talk about Mountainshadow's Drakes, but if they were to get their hands on a Drake, it would probably end up down in the labs and research areas below Iopos. It's unlikely that they would have an area elsewhere. It's possible, I suppose, but given the importance, they would probably want to have it very close and in a place that would be very difficult for a dragon to infiltrate or for dragon servants to infiltrate and deal with. Yeah.
I just figured I'd ask a presumptive question that just in case anybody wanted to ask us in an email later on, just to hear your thoughts on possibly what could they do to solve that mystery and therefore quench Mountainshadow's curiosity about his servants that are missing. So just a thought. Anything else we should talk about from Mountainshadow's motives or servants or any other ways to work him in? Because I think he's pretty much one of the easier dragons to work in.
Yeah.
Since he wants to know a lot.
I mean, if you're looking at potential allies or employers or patrons for your typical adventuring company, adventuring group in Earthdawn, Mountainshadow is pretty high up on the list, especially where he has such a desire to understand everything. It's not much of a stretch to try and tie that into what your group might be up to. Some of the other dragons that we'll be talking about later on are a little bit more selective in their areas of interest. And so you might not necessarily have as easy a time tying them into things. But Mountainshadow is one of those where it's not that difficult, especially if you're dealing with a game that's going to be digging into forgotten lore or magical secrets or history, or anything like that could potentially draw his interest.
Yeah. I can say it's an easy side quest, but it's at least it's an easy idea for a side quest. Okay. Go find one of his servants or go find Mountainshadow because you have this information or you need this information. Do you think Mountainshadow would take payment, money, or what would he actually, if you provide him enough information, or sorry, if you need information about this item or this history thing or so forth and so on, is Mountainshadow going to take your cash? Really?
No, Mountainshadow's not going to take your cash. It's at that point where you need to think about what is it that Mountainshadow might be after, and what kind of task he might ask the group to perform for him. Mm-hmm. There's always the nerve-wracking possibility of a favor to be named later.
Always.
Because owing a dragon is
sort of Damocles
kind of a scary
over
thought.
your head. I just wanted to say, probably he's not going to want your silver.
Mere cash is probably not going to do it for him. You could probably, if you found an appropriately interesting item, might be able to deal with that.
Yeah, might be able to forfeit that for the information you need.
Possibly.
In that exchange. Maybe, if it's a really good thing. But figured at least proffer the question. What would you pay a dragon? Well, a dragon doesn't necessarily want your silver or your gold, especially not your copper. So, yeah, what would it be? Well, to your point, it's you do me this favor. He's kind of like a mafia don in that case. You do me this favor over here. No, really bad accent on my part. Anyway, any final thoughts on Mountainshadow and his involvement and how to use him in a campaign?
No.
Yeah, he's pretty straightforward.
He's pretty straightforward. We started off easy.
Yes.
Here.
On purpose.
On purpose.
We'll get to the tough ones a little bit later on, expand upon those as we see fit. But until next time, folks, feel free to email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Ask us any questions you want about Mountainshadow or anything else we've ever talked about, because last podcast was an email palooza. We don't wait for them to pile up. We had a bunch this last time because we asked for them. And that happens. So until next time, since we talked about the meddler, it is time for you to go meddle in your own legend.
Good night, everybody.